Sometimes the loneliest hearts speak the loudest words. In the small town of Dustwood, schoolteacher Miss Evelyn Hart had grown tired of whispered gossip about her unmarried state at 28. Standing before the judgmental town council, she declared in frustration, "If any man in this town can read Latin, I'll marry him." The men chuckled, knowing no cowboy or shopkeeper possessed such education. But Cole Thatcher, the quiet ranch hand who kept to himself, stepped forward and began reciting Virgil's Aeneid with perfect pronunciation. The room fell silent as his deep voice carried the ancient words with scholarly precision. Evelyn's heart raced not from embarrassment, but from something she'd never felt before. What was a learned man doing working cattle in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Evelyn Hart stepped into the one-room schoolhouse that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The morning light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden desks where tomorrow's leaders of Dustwood would struggle with their letters and numbers. She touched the teaching certificate hanging on the wall, a piece of parchment that represented everything she had sacrificed to earn her place in this unforgiving frontier town. Dustwood, Montana territory was not a place where dreams came easily. Nestled between rolling hills of prairie grass and jagged mountain peaks, it existed as a testament to human stubbornness rather than human wisdom. The main street stretched barely 200 yards, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better decades. Peterson's General Store anchored one end, while Murphy's Saloon claimed the other, with the schoolhouse, church, and handful of other establishments scattered between like afterthoughts. Evelyn had arrived 3 years ago from Boston, carrying little more than her teaching credentials and a determination to make something of herself beyond the expectations of polite society. Back east, she had been the daughter of a failed merchant, destined for spinsterhood or a desperate marriage to whoever would have her. Here, she could be Miss Hart, the educated woman who brought learning to the children of ranchers, storekeepers, and drifters who had found their way to this remote corner of the world. The schoolhouse itself bore witness to the town's rough beginnings. Built from local pine and chinked with mud, it served multiple purposes: classroom during the week, meeting hall for town business, and church on Sundays when the circuit preacher made his monthly rounds. Evelyn had arranged the space with care, creating separate areas for different age groups and turning one corner into a small library with the dozen books she had managed to acquire through careful correspondence with Eastern publishers. Her daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. She arrived early to stoke the wood stove, arrange lessons on the slate board, and prepare for the 15 students who would file in throughout the morning. Some, like young Timothy Whitman, showed genuine promise. Others, like the Riley twins, seemed more interested in disrupting lessons than learning them. But Evelyn persisted, knowing that education was often the only path out of the hard scrabble life that claimed so many on the frontier. The morning progressed as usual until Mayor Whitman arrived with his customary scowl and his equally customary complaints about the school budget. Harold Whitman was a man who measured everything in dollars and cents, including the value of educating his own son. Behind him shuffled the other members of the town council: Doc Brennan, who doubled as veterinarian and human physician depending on the emergency, Samuel Peterson from the general store, and Mrs. Crenshaw, the minister's wife, who appointed herself moral guardian of the entire community. "Miss Hart," Mayor Whitman began without preamble, "we need to discuss your situation." Evelyn set down her chalk and turned to face them, smoothing her simple brown dress, one of only 3 she owned. "My situation, Mayor? Your unmarried situation?" Mrs. Crenshaw interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed her opinions were divine revelations. "It's unseemly for a single woman to be teaching our children. People talk. People always talk." Evelyn replied, keeping her voice level despite the familiar anger rising in her chest. I fail to see how my marital status affects my ability to teach multiplication tables or proper penmanship. Doc Brennan, ever the diplomat, cleared his throat. Now, Evelyn, nobody's questioning your teaching abilities. But you have to understand the position this puts us in. Some of the families are concerned about, well, about propriety. Propriety? Evelyn's control slipped slightly. I've been nothing but proper for 3 years. I attend church. I keep to myself. I've never given anyone cause for gossip beyond the terrible crime of remaining unmarried at 28. That's precisely the problem, Mrs. Crenshaw said, warming to her subject. A woman your age, still single, living alone, it raises questions. What questions could it possibly raise? That I'm capable of supporting myself? That I have a purpose beyond finding a husband? Mayor Whitman shifted uncomfortably. Look, Miss Hart, we're not saying you need to leave town. But if you could see your way clear to settling down with someone respectable, it would solve everyone's problems. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Evelyn looked around the room that had become her life's work, at the carefully arranged desks and the slate board covered with the day's lessons, at her precious teaching certificate hanging on the wall. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her like a physical thing. "If any man in this town can read Latin," she declared, the words escaping before she could stop them, "I'll marry him." The silence that followed was profound. Even the children, sensing the tension, had stopped their usual whispers and fidgeting. Mayor Whitman's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, while Mrs. Crenshaw looked as though she had bitten into something particularly sour. "Latin?" Doc Brennan asked finally. "The dead language? The classical language," Evelyn corrected. "The foundation of law, medicine, and scholarship. If this town is so concerned about my marital status, then let them produce a man with enough education to appreciate what marriage to a teacher might offer." She had meant it as a challenge that couldn't be met, a way to silence their demands while highlighting the absurdity of their expectations. No one in Dustwood spoke Latin. The highest education most men possessed was the ability to read a bill of sale and sign their names. Her challenge was safe, unanswerable. That's when Cole Thatcher stepped forward. Evelyn had noticed him before, of course. In a town the size of Dustwood, everyone noticed everyone. He worked for the Patterson Ranch outside town, riding in occasionally for supplies or to collect the mail. He was tall and lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of hard work. His brown hair was always neatly trimmed despite his rough occupation, and he had a habit of touching the brim of his hat respectfully when he passed ladies on the street. But he never spoke beyond the necessary courtesies, never lingered in the saloon like the other ranch hands, never attended the town's rare social gatherings. He was a mystery wrapped in work clothes and silence, notable mainly for how unremarkable he tried to make himself. Now he stood before the assembled council and the room full of children, his hat in his hands, his grey eyes fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Arma virumque cano, Troie qui primus aboris Italiam, fato profugus, Laviniac venit litora, multum ille et terris iactatus et alto, vi superum saeve memorem iunonis ob iram," he began, his voice clear and strong. The opening lines of the Aeneid flowed from his lips with perfect pronunciation, each word precisely enunciated, the rhythm of Virgil's epic verse filling the schoolhouse like music. He continued for several stanzas, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face, speaking of arms and the man, of Trojan shores and divine wrath, of a hero driven by fate to found a great nation. When he finished, the silence was complete. Even the flies buzzing against the window seemed to have paused in their efforts. Mayor Whitman stared, as though Cole had just sprouted wings. Mrs. Crenshaw's fan fluttered rapidly before her flushed face. The children sat wide-eyed, sensing they had witnessed something momentous without quite understanding what it was. Cole replaced his hat and nodded to Evelyn. "Miss Hart," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out of the schoolhouse, leaving behind questions that would echo through Dustwood for days to come. The remainder of the school day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and stolen glances toward the door through which Cole Thatcher had disappeared. Evelyn attempted to continue with her planned lessons, but her students' attention had evaporated like morning dew under a hot sun. Even young Timothy Whitman, usually her most dedicated pupil, spent more time staring out the window than at his arithmetic slate. When the final student had departed, Evelyn found herself alone with the weight of what had transpired. She walked to her desk and sat heavily in the wooden chair that had been donated by Peterson's store, a simple thing that somehow managed to be both too hard and too soft at the same time. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the leather journal, where she recorded daily lessons and student progress. Instead of writing, she found herself staring at the teaching certificate on the wall. The document that had once represented freedom now seemed to mock her with its formal language and official seal. She had earned that certificate through years of study, sacrificing the social opportunities that other young women took for granted. While her former classmates had attended dances and received callers, Evelyn had pored over textbooks and pedagogy manuals, preparing herself for a life of independence. Now, with a dozen words in a dead language, a cowboy had turned her carefully constructed world upside down. The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside made her heart skip. She knew, somehow, that it was him returning. Cole Thatcher entered the schoolhouse with the same quiet confidence he had displayed earlier, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The afternoon light from the window fell across his face, and Evelyn noticed details she had missed before. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of time spent squinting into the sun, the precise way he held himself, the hands that were calloused but clean. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirts more from nervousness than necessity. "Mr. Thatcher, I must confess, I'm at something of a loss for words." "That seems unlikely," he replied, and there was the hint of a smile in his voice. "From what I've observed, words are rarely in short supply where you're concerned." Heat rose in her cheeks. "You've been observing me?" "In a town this size, everyone observes everyone. But yes, I've noticed that you have opinions and aren't afraid to express them. It's refreshing." He moved closer, not in a threatening way, but with the measured steps of someone who understood the importance of not startling skittish creatures. Evelyn realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. "Mr. Thatcher, I should explain about this afternoon. What I said, it was spoken in frustration. You didn't expect anyone to meet your challenge." He set his hat on one of the student desks with careful precision. "May I ask why you chose Latin specifically?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected him to press about the marriage proposal, not inquire about her educational philosophy. Latin is the foundation of higher learning. Law, medicine, theology, they all require it. I thought it would be impossible to find someone with that background in a place like Dustwood, and yet here I am." "Yes." She studied his face, searching for clues to the mystery he had revealed. "Here you are, a ranch hand who quotes Virgil with the precision of a university professor. Forgive my confusion, but that raises certain questions." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Questions I'm not ready to answer, but I want you to know that I didn't step forward on a whim. I've been watching you teach, seeing how you care for those children, observing your strength in the face of people who would diminish you for their own comfort. When you made that challenge, I saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To offer something real. Not the desperation that drives most frontier marriages, but something built on mutual respect and shared understanding." Evelyn sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the turn her day had taken. You speak as though you've given this considerable thought. I have. He pulled out a small leather-bound journal from his vest pocket, its cover worn smooth by handling. May I show you something? When she nodded, he opened the journal to a page covered with neat handwriting. Even at a distance, she could see it wasn't English. He turned the book toward her, and she recognized lines of poetry in what appeared to be Latin. You wrote this? Some of it. Other passages I copied because they spoke to me. He closed the journal carefully. I know this is unconventional. I know you have every right to dismiss what happened today as the foolishness of a cowboy with pretensions above his station. But I'm hoping you might consider the possibility that there's more to this situation than either of us initially imagined. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and it unsettled Evelyn more than arrogance would have. She had prepared herself to deal with rough men who might see her challenge as an opportunity to claim an educated wife like a prize. She hadn't prepared for someone who spoke of mutual respect and shared understanding. Mr. Thatcher, even if I were inclined to take your proposal seriously, which I'm not entirely certain I am, there are practical considerations. The town council expects me to marry quickly or risk losing my position. You're asking me to trust my entire future to a man I know nothing about. Then get to know me. The words were simple, but the way he said them carried an intensity that made her pulse quicken. I'm not asking you to make a decision today, or even next week, but give me a chance to prove that I'm worthy of your consideration. And if you're not, if this is all some elaborate deception, for the first time, Cole smiled a real smile that transformed his serious features. Then you'll have discovered the truth about my character, and you can dismiss me with a clear conscience. But I don't think that's what will happen. You seem remarkably confident for someone whose entire romantic strategy is based on classical literature. Not just classical literature, he said, his smile widening. Though I admit it's proven more effective than I anticipated. Despite herself, Evelyn found herself fighting back a smile of her own. The situation was absurd, a conversation about courtship with a cowboy who quoted Virgil in a one-room schoolhouse while the sun set over the Montana territory. Yet there was something about Cole Thatcher that made the absurd seem almost reasonable. What exactly are you proposing? Time, he said simply. Time for you to know me and for me to prove that I understand what marriage to someone like you would mean. I'm not asking you to lower your standards or abandon your dreams. I'm asking you to consider that they might be achieved in ways you hadn't imagined. The proposition hung between them, like a bridge that might lead somewhere wonderful or might collapse under the weight of expectation. Evelyn looked around the schoolhouse that had been her world for 3 years, then back at the man who had just offered to expand that world beyond anything she had dared to hope for. I suppose, she said carefully, a brief courtship wouldn't be entirely unreasonable, if only to satisfy my curiosity about how a ranch hand came to memorize epic poetry. Cole's smile was answer enough. 3 days had passed since Cole's unexpected recitation, and Dustwood buzzed with speculation like a hive disturbed by smoke. Evelyn could feel the weight of curious stares wherever she went, from Mrs. Henderson at the post office to old Jake Murphy, sweeping the front of his saloon. The town had collectively decided that the quiet schoolteacher and the mysterious ranch hand were the most interesting thing to happen in months. Evelyn tried to maintain her normal routine, but normalcy had become an elusive thing. She found herself glancing toward the schoolhouse door more frequently than she cared to admit, and when Cole finally appeared Thursday afternoon, she felt an unwelcome flutter of anticipation in her chest. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers, not the carefully cultivated roses that city gentlemen might present, but a collection of prairie blooms that spoke of time and attention to gather. Indian paintbrush mixed with lupine and wild columbine, their colors bright against the weathered wood of the schoolhouse wall. Miss Hart, he said with the formal courtesy that was becoming familiar, I thought you might appreciate these for your classroom. She accepted the flowers with hands that she hoped weren't visibly trembling. They're lovely, thank you. As she arranged them in the water pitcher that served as her only vase, she noticed something tucked among the stems. A pressed wildflower, perfectly preserved, had been placed carefully within the bouquet. When she looked up questioningly, Cole simply nodded toward her lesson books. Later that evening, after the last student had departed and she was alone to examine her gift properly, Evelyn discovered the pressed flower had been slipped between the pages of her copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of the few classical texts she had managed to acquire for the school's modest library. The flower marked a passage about transformation, about the possibility of becoming something new without losing what was essential. The gesture was subtle, thoughtful, and surprisingly intimate. It suggested a man who paid attention to details, who understood the power of symbols and metaphor. It also suggested someone who knew she would recognize the reference and appreciate its significance. Over the following days, Cole's courtship revealed itself to be unlike anything Evelyn had experienced. He didn't arrive with grand declarations or expensive gifts. Instead, he came with small kindnesses that demonstrated careful observation of her daily life. When he noticed her struggling with the heavy wood box for the school stove, he appeared the next morning with an armload of pre-split kindling. When she mentioned in passing that several students were having trouble with their penmanship, he quietly repaired the broken tip on her best pen during lunch. Their conversations were a revelation. Where Evelyn had expected awkward silences or discussions limited to weather and local gossip, she found a man who could discuss literature with genuine insight, who asked thoughtful questions about her teaching methods, and who listened to her opinions with the attention most men reserved for business matters. "You mentioned yesterday that young Sarah Patterson struggles with mathematics," Cole said one afternoon as they walked together through the small garden behind the schoolhouse. "Have you considered that she might learn better through practical applications?" Evelyn paused beside the struggling tomato plants she had been attempting to cultivate. "What do you mean?" "On the ranch, we use mathematics constantly calculating feed ratios, measuring distances for fencing, determining how many cattle a section of land can support. It's not abstract numbers on a slate. It's solving real problems that matter." "You're suggesting I teach arithmetic through ranching examples. I'm suggesting you teach it through any examples that connect to your students' lives. Sarah helps her mother with cooking and preserving food. Teach fractions through recipes. Show multiplication through planning how many jars are needed for different-sized batches." The idea was so simple and practical that Evelyn felt embarrassed for not having thought of it herself. "That's quite insightful, Mr. Thatcher." "That's Cole," he said gently. "If we're to be married, perhaps we might use given names." "If we're to be married," she repeated, surprised at how the words didn't sound as foreign as she expected. "You seem very confident that we will be." "I'm hopeful that we will be," he corrected. "There's a difference." They had paused beside the fence that separated the school property from the open prairie beyond. In the distance, mountains rose like ancient guardians against the sky, their peaks still touched with snow despite the late spring warmth. The vastness of the landscape never failed to humble Evelyn, reminding her of how small human concerns could seem when measured against such permanence. "May I ask you something, Cole?" "Of course." "Why me? Surely there are younger women in town, women without the complications that come with being the schoolteacher." He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of consideration that suggested he had been thinking about this question long before she asked it. "Because you're not trying to be someone else to please others. You're exactly who you are, intelligent, principled, unafraid to stand up for what you believe in. You could have married some clerk back in Boston and spent your life pouring tea for his business associates. Instead, you came west to build something meaningful with your life. That takes a kind of courage that most people never develop." The sincerity in his words made something warm unfurl in Evelyn's chest. "You speak as though you know something about building a life far from where you started." Again, that moment of hesitation, as though he were carefully choosing what to reveal. Everyone who ends up in a place like Dustwood has left something behind. The question is whether what you're building is better than what you left. And is it? For you, I mean. Cole looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'm beginning to think it might be. That evening, as Evelyn prepared for bed in the small room behind the schoolhouse that served as her living quarters, she found herself thinking about transformation, about the pressed flower in her book and the way Cole spoke about education and the possibility that her carefully planned life might be taking an entirely unexpected turn. She had come to the frontier seeking independence and found it, but she was beginning to realize that independence didn't necessarily mean solitude. Perhaps it meant having the freedom to choose who to share that independence with, and choosing someone who understood and respected what that independence meant to her. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. For 3 years, she had built her identity around being Miss Hart, the unmarried schoolteacher who needed no one's approval or support. Now she was contemplating becoming Mrs. Thatcher, married to a man whose past remained largely a mystery, but whose present attention made her feel more valued than she had ever imagined possible. Outside her window, night settled over Dustwood, with the quiet completeness that only frontier towns knew. Somewhere in that darkness, Cole was probably reading by lamplight in whatever accommodations the Patterson Ranch provided for their hands. Evelyn found herself wondering what he was reading, whether it was more classical poetry or perhaps something entirely different. She realized she was looking forward to finding out, and that realization marked a shift in her thinking that she wasn't entirely prepared to acknowledge. The pressed wildflower in her book had marked a passage about transformation, and Evelyn was beginning to understand that transformation was exactly what was happening to her. The chess set appeared on a Tuesday morning, placed carefully on Evelyn's desk like an offering to the gods of intellectual pursuit. Each piece had been carved from local wood with a precision that spoke of countless patient hours. The knights were particularly beautiful, their flowing manes and spirited eyes capturing a sense of movement even in stillness. The pawns were simple but elegant, and the king and queen bore tiny details that revealed themselves only upon close examination. Evelyn ran her fingers over the smooth surface of a bishop, marveling at the craftsmanship. The wood was warm to the touch and smelled faintly of the oil used to finish it. This was not the work of an afternoon or even a week. This represented dedication and skill that spoke to depths in Cole's character she had only begun to discover. "Do you play?" Cole's voice from the doorway made her look up. He stood with his hat in his hands, watching her reaction with an expression that might have been nervousness if she hadn't been learning that Cole Thatcher was rarely nervous about anything. "I learned as a child," she said, setting the piece carefully back in its position. "My father taught me. He said it was good training for the mind, regardless of gender. Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. He would have appreciated this. She gestured to the chess set. "The workmanship is remarkable. You made this?" "Winter evenings are long on a ranch. A man needs projects to keep his hands busy." Cole stepped into the schoolhouse, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. "I was hoping you might be willing to play a game or two, if your schedule permits, that is." Evelyn considered the proposition. Playing chess with Cole would mean spending evening hours in his company, alone in the schoolhouse after the children had departed. It would provide more opportunities for conversation, for learning about the enigma he presented. It would also provide more opportunities for the kind of intimate intellectual connection that she was finding increasingly dangerous to her carefully maintained independence. "I should warn you," she said, moving to sit behind the white pieces. "I'm not an easy opponent. My father didn't believe in allowing me to win simply because I was his daughter. I wouldn't expect anything less." Cole took the chair across from her, his long frame folding into the small student seat with practiced grace. "Shall we begin?" The game revealed aspects of Cole's character that their conversations had only hinted at. He played with the same careful patience he brought to everything else, considering each move thoroughly, but without the hesitation that marked indecisive players. His strategy was classical: control the center, develop pieces harmoniously, castle early for safety. But within that conventional framework, he showed flashes of creativity that kept Evelyn constantly alert. "You play like someone with formal training," she observed after he executed a particularly elegant combination that won her queen's bishop. "Books," he said simply, moving his knight to threaten her remaining rook. "There are excellent chess manuals available if you know where to look for them. And you know where to look for them?" That familiar pause, the moment of careful consideration that always accompanied questions about his background. "I've always been curious about learning. Chess seemed worth studying." It wasn't exactly an answer, but Evelyn was beginning to understand that Cole revealed himself gradually, like a sunrise that transformed darkness by degrees rather than dramatic revelation. She moved her rook to safety and watched him consider his next play. "Tell me about your students," he said, apparently deciding to shift the conversation away from himself. "Which ones show the most promise?" "Timothy Whitman has a good mathematical mind. Sarah Patterson, once I started using your suggestion about practical applications, has improved remarkably. The Riley twins are hopeless at academics, but they have a natural understanding of mechanics that might serve them well if they can channel it properly. And the others?" "Little Mary Chen struggles with English because it's not her first language, but she has remarkable artistic ability. I've been letting her illustrate some of our reading materials. Thomas Burke reads voraciously when he can get his hands on books. I think he might benefit from more challenging material if I can find it." Cole captured one of her pawns with his queen, a move that opened up new possibilities in the center of the board. "You speak about them with genuine affection. They're good children, most of them. They deserve better than what this frontier life typically offers." Evelyn studied the board, looking for a way to counter his increasing pressure on her king. "That's why the school matters so much to me. It's their chance for something more." "And what about your chance for something more?" The question caught her in the middle of contemplating a knight move. She looked up to find Cole watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I'm not certain I understand. You've spent 3 years giving everything you have to other people's children. What about your own dreams, your own future?" "Teaching is my future. It's what I trained for, what I'm good at. But is it all you want?" The directness of the question unsettled her. She made the knight move, perhaps not the best choice strategically, but the one that bought her time to think. "What else should I want? I don't know. That's what I'm asking." Evelyn considered the question seriously, something she realized she hadn't done in a long time. What did she want beyond the security of her teaching position and the satisfaction of watching children learn? The answer, when it came to her, was both obvious and surprising. "Partnership, I think. Someone to share ideas with, to discuss books and philosophy and whether Thomas Jefferson was right about the relationship between education and democracy. Someone who understands that conversation can be as intimate as physical closeness." That seems like a reasonable thing to want. Reasonable, perhaps, but not particularly practical in a place like Dustwood. She realized as she said it that Cole was offering exactly what she had described, and the realization made her move her queen without proper consideration. He took it immediately with his bishop, and she found herself in a losing position. "You weren't paying attention to the board," he observed gently. "I was distracted by the conversation." Good conversations should be distracting. Cole studied the position, then made a move that surprised her. Instead of pressing his advantage, he offered a trade that would simplify the position and give her better chances. "Shall we call this game a draw and start another?" The gesture was small but significant. He could have defeated her easily, but he chose instead to give her another chance. It was, she realized, a metaphor for what he was offering in their courtship, not victory over her independence, but partnership that honored both their strengths. "Yes," she said, beginning to reset the pieces. "Let's start another." As they played their second game, the conversation flowed more easily. Cole asked thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and shared observations about the children he had seen around town. He spoke about books he had read, revealing a breadth of knowledge that continued to astonish her. He discussed philosophy and literature with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about such matters. By the time they finished their third game, this one, a legitimate draw that required all of Evelyn's concentration, the sun had set and lamplight flickered across the chess pieces. The intimate atmosphere of the small schoolhouse, warm from the day's heat and filled with the comfortable silence of shared intellectual engagement, created a sense of domestic tranquility that Evelyn found unexpectedly appealing. "I should be getting back to the ranch," Cole said, though he made no immediate move to collect his hat. "Mrs. Patterson worries if the hands are out too late." "Of course." Evelyn began carefully packing the chess pieces into their box. "Thank you for this, both the set and the games. Thank you for accepting the gift, and for providing such challenging opposition. Perhaps we could play again tomorrow evening, if that wouldn't be presumptuous." Cole's smile was all the answer she needed. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "Evelyn, may I say something?" The use of her given name made her look up sharply. "What is it? You asked what you should want beyond teaching. I think you should want everything you've ever dreamed of, and more besides. Anyone who settles for less than that isn't worthy of who you are." He left before she could respond, but his words echoed in the quiet schoolhouse long after his footsteps had faded into the night. Evelyn sat alone among the chess pieces, considering transformation and partnership and the unexpected possibility that her carefully planned life might be about to become something she had never dared to imagine. The discovery happened entirely by accident. Evelyn was collecting the chess pieces after their Thursday evening game when Cole's movement to retrieve his jacket from the back of his chair sent something small and rectangular skittering across the wooden floor. The sound was sharp in the quiet schoolhouse, the specific tap of treated paper against wood that could only be a photograph. Cole moved quickly to retrieve it, but not quickly enough. In the moment before his hand covered the daguerreotype, Evelyn caught a glimpse of the image. A young man in formal dress, standing beside what appeared to be a university building, his pose suggesting the confidence that came with education and privilege. The man in the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to Cole, but this was Cole transformed, hair neatly pomaded, clothing expensive and well-tailored, bearing the unmistakable polish of Eastern sophistication. "I'm sorry," Cole said, slipping the photograph quickly into his vest pocket. "It must have fallen from my jacket." But the damage was done. The image had shattered Evelyn's growing sense of knowing this man, replacing it with questions that multiplied like cracks in ice. The formal dress, the university setting, the bearing of someone accustomed to comfort and status, none of it aligned with the story of a ranch hand who had simply read widely and taught himself classical languages. "Cole," she said carefully, setting down the chess piece she had been holding. "Who are you?" The question hung between them like a challenge neither was prepared to meet. Cole stood frozen by his chair, one hand still touching the pocket where he had hidden the photograph, his grey eyes reflecting something that might have been pain or fear or both. "I'm exactly who I've shown myself to be," he said finally. "Are you? Because that photograph suggests otherwise. The photograph is from another life, one that has no bearing on who I am now or what I'm offering you." Evelyn studied his face, searching for clues to the mystery that seemed to deepen with every conversation. "You were educated back east, that much is obvious. The university in the photograph, was that where you learned Latin, among other things? What other things? What did you study? Why are you working cattle in Montana instead of practicing whatever profession you trained for?" Each question seemed to increase the tension in Cole's shoulders. He moved to the window, staring out at the darkness that had settled over Dustwood like a blanket. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "There are things in my past that I'm not ready to discuss, not because I don't trust you, but because they're complicated in ways that might affect how you see me." "You mean they might affect whether I choose to marry you?" "I choose. Yes." The honesty of his admission was both refreshing and troubling. Evelyn appreciated that he didn't try to deflect or minimize her concerns, but his acknowledgement that his past contained secrets significant enough to change her opinion created new anxieties. "Cole, I'm asking you to trust me with your future. Don't you think that requires some measure of honesty about your past?" He turned from the window to face her, and she was struck by the conflict evident in his expression. This was a man wrestling with competing loyalties, the desire to be truthful with her and the need to protect whatever secrets he carried. "What if I told you that my past includes things I'm not proud of, mistakes that hurt people I cared about? Would that change how you feel about what we're building together?" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "It would depend on the nature of those mistakes and whether you've learned from them. And what if the mistakes weren't entirely my fault, but the consequences fell on me anyway? What if telling you the truth might put you in danger?" The word danger struck her like a physical blow. In all her considerations about Cole's mysterious background, she hadn't imagined that it might involve actual peril. What kind of danger? The kind that comes from people who don't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent when they're seeking justice or revenge. Evelyn sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was suggesting. "Are you telling me that you're running from something? That by associating with you, I might be putting myself and my students at risk? I'm telling you that I came to Dustwood to start over, to build a life where the mistakes of my past couldn't follow me. I thought I had succeeded until I met you and realized that any life built on deception, however well-intentioned, isn't worthy of someone like you." The admission was raw and honest in a way that cut through Evelyn's growing anger and replaced it with something approaching understanding. She had demanded truth from him, and he was giving it to her, not the complete truth perhaps, but an acknowledgement that there was more to his story than he had revealed. "So what are you proposing? That I take you on faith despite not knowing what I'm taking on?" "I'm proposing that you give me time to find a way to tell you everything without putting either of us at risk. I'm proposing that you judge me by the man I've shown myself to be over these past weeks, rather than by shadows from a past I'm trying to escape." The request was reasonable on its surface, but it asked for a level of trust that went beyond anything Evelyn had ever contemplated. She had spent 3 years building a life based on her own abilities and judgment. Now Cole was asking her to make the most important decision of her life, while accepting that crucial information would remain hidden. "You're asking me to marry a man I don't really know. You know me better than anyone has in years. You know my character, my values, my feelings for you. You know that I respect your intelligence and your independence, that I want to build something with you rather than simply claiming you as a prize. Isn't that more important than knowing every detail of what happened before we met?" There was truth in what he said, but it was truth that frightened her. Over the weeks of their courtship, she had come to know Cole as gentle, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her dreams and opinions. He had shown himself to be educated and articulate, patient with her students, and respectful of her position in ways that most frontier men would never consider. But the photograph suggested a past that included wealth, status, and the kind of education that opened doors in Eastern society. If Cole had possessed all of that and given it up to become a ranch hand in Montana territory, what had driven him to such a dramatic change? And if his past contained elements dangerous enough to threaten her safety, how could she reconcile that with the gentle man who carved chess pieces and brought her wildflowers? "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course you do. I wouldn't expect otherwise." Cole collected his hat and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Evelyn, whatever else you think about what I've told you tonight, please believe this. Everything I've felt for you, everything I've shared with you about who I am now, that's all completely real. The past may be complicated, but my feelings for you are simple and true." After he left, Evelyn sat alone in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the chess pieces that had sparked her growing feelings for this mysterious man. The carved figures seemed to watch her with wooden eyes, silent witnesses to a courtship that had just become far more complex than she had ever imagined. She picked up the White Queen, remembering how Cole had carved the tiny details of her crown with such care. Every piece in the set showed the same attention to beauty and proportion, the work of someone who understood the relationship between patience and perfection. It was the work of a man she was falling in love with, and that realization was perhaps the most troubling discovery of all. Because despite the secrets and the hints of danger, despite the photograph that suggested he was someone entirely different from who he claimed to be, Evelyn was beginning to understand that her feelings for Cole had progressed beyond the safe realm of intellectual interest and mutual respect. She was falling in love with a man whose true identity remained a mystery, and that love made her vulnerable in ways that her carefully constructed independence had never prepared her to handle. The bundle of letters was discovered by pure accident when Mrs. Patterson's prize rooster knocked over a loose board in Cole's small quarters above the ranch's equipment shed. Evelyn had come to deliver some books she thought might interest him, a thin excuse to see him after their awkward conversation about his mysterious past. She arrived to find Cole kneeling on the floor, frantically gathering scattered papers like a man trying to collect his scattered secrets before they could be read. "I should go," Evelyn said from the doorway, recognizing immediately that she had stumbled into something deeply personal. "No." Cole's voice was strained. "You've already seen. Perhaps it's time you knew everything." The letters were numerous, perhaps 30 or 40 in total, all addressed to the same person, Miss Catherine Whitmore of Philadelphia. Each envelope bore Cole's careful handwriting and return address, but none showed signs of having been sent. The dates spanned several years, with the most recent postmarked only months before Cole had appeared in Dustwood. "You've been writing to someone named Catherine," Evelyn observed, trying to keep the jealousy from her voice. "Writing to her, yes, but never sending them." Cole sat back on his heels, abandoning his attempt to gather the correspondence. "After what happened, I couldn't send them, but I couldn't stop writing them either." "What happened?" The question hung between them like a challenge neither was prepared to meet. Cole picked up one of the letters, holding it with the reverence reserved for sacred relics or deadly weapons. "Catherine was my fiancée. We were to be married after I completed my medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania." The admission struck Evelyn like a physical blow. A fiancé, medical degree. The pieces of Cole's mysterious background were falling into place, but the picture they created was more complicated than she had imagined. "You're a doctor." "I was studying to be one. I never completed my training." He opened one of the letters, revealing pages covered with his precise handwriting. Catherine was everything a young medical student could want: beautiful, accomplished, from a prominent Philadelphia family. "Her father arranged our engagement because my family had business connections he valued. But you loved her." "I thought I did. Or perhaps I loved the idea of her, the life we were supposed to build together. We shared interests in literature and music. I assumed deeper feelings would develop over time, as they often did in arranged marriages." Evelyn knelt beside him on the rough wooden floor, close enough to see the careful script that covered the pages. "What changed?" Cole was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and guilt. "I discovered she was meeting secretly with James Morrison, a young man her father considered unsuitable for marriage. At first I felt only hurt and confusion, then anger. Then I made the most foolish decision of my life. I confronted them both." The morning light filtering through the small window seemed to grow dimmer as Cole continued his story, each word carefully chosen as though he were giving testimony in a court of law. The confrontation took place in her father's garden, during an evening party. I found them together near the fountain, and my emotions overcame my judgment. I accused James of corrupting Catherine, of taking advantage of her innocence. He had been drinking, and when I suggested he was unworthy of her attention, he struck me. Cole's hands tightened on the letter he held. I struck back. James stumbled, fell backward against the marble edge of the fountain. The sound his head made. He stopped, unable to continue for a moment. He never regained consciousness. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs as the full implications of Cole's story became clear. You killed him, not intentionally, but just as permanently as if I had planned it. Catherine screamed. People came running from the party. By the time the authorities arrived, she had convinced herself and everyone else that I had attacked James in a murderous rage. But surely there were witnesses who could testify that he struck first. There were witnesses who saw what they expected to see, a jealous fiancé losing control over a woman's affections. James Morrison was beloved by Philadelphia society, charming, generous, from one of the city's oldest families. I was merely the son of a merchant, trying to rise above my station through education and an advantageous marriage. The tragedy of it overwhelmed Evelyn. Not just the accidental death, but the social forces that had transformed self-defense into murder in the eyes of the law. So you fled. What choice did I have? Catherine's testimony, combined with my outsider status and the physical evidence, made conviction certain. The newspapers had already decided my guilt before any trial could take place. Evelyn picked up one of the unopened letters, noting how Cole's handwriting had changed over the years, becoming more controlled, more careful, as though even his penmanship had learned to hide its emotions. These letters, what do they say? Everything I wanted to tell her. Apologies, explanations, questions I'll never receive answers to. I kept writing because stopping felt like admitting that everything we had meant nothing. May I read one? Cole handed her an envelope dated just 6 months prior. The letter inside revealed the depth of his ongoing torment. Catherine, I wake some mornings and forget, for just a moment, what I've become. Then memory returns, and with it the weight of that night when everything changed. I wonder if you think of James, if you remember him as he was before anger and wine and my own pride destroyed everything. I tell myself I acted to defend your honor, but perhaps I was only defending my wounded vanity. The distinction matters less now than it did then. James is still gone, and I remain responsible. The letter continued for several pages, examining every aspect of that fatal confrontation with the thoroughness of someone who had relived each moment countless times. It revealed a mind capable of brutal self-examination and a heart carrying guilt that had clearly shaped every decision he had made since. You blame yourself entirely, Evelyn observed. Who else should bear that responsibility? Yes, James struck first, but I chose to retaliate. I could have walked away. I could have found another way to address the situation. Instead, I let anger control my actions, and a man died because of my choices. And what of Catherine's role? She was deceiving both you and her father, meeting another man secretly while engaged to you. Doesn't she bear some responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to tragedy? Cole looked at her with something approaching surprise. You sound as though you're defending me. I'm trying to understand what actually happened versus what you've convinced yourself happened. Evelyn set the letter carefully aside. Cole, you discovered your fiancé's betrayal, confronted the situation, were attacked, and defended yourself. James Morrison's death was a tragic accident, not premeditated murder. The legal system might disagree. The legal system isn't here. I am. The words came out with more force than she intended. You've spent years punishing yourself for an accident that resulted from other people's deception and violence. How can you dismiss what I've done? I killed a man, Evelyn. Whatever the circumstances, my actions led directly to James Morrison's death. Your reaction led to his death, yes, but that reaction was provoked by betrayal and physical attack. Evelyn reached for his hands, feeling their slight tremor. Cole, I'm not saying you bear no responsibility, but accepting complete blame for something involving multiple people making questionable choices isn't justice, it's self-destruction. For the first time since she had known him, Cole's carefully maintained composure cracked. His shoulders shook with suppressed emotion, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with years of contained pain. I've carried this burden every day since it happened. I've told myself I deserved whatever punishment fate delivered, that I had forfeited any right to happiness or love or the future I'd planned. When I met you, when I began to feel... He stopped, struggling to continue. When you began to feel what? When I began to believe that perhaps I could have a life worth living after all, that maybe the man I've become here in Dustwood is someone worthy of respect, even love. But then I remember that night, and I question whether someone like you could accept someone like me. Evelyn felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of this complicated man. This was the complete truth she had demanded, not just the facts of his past, but the emotional reality of how those facts had transformed him. This was vulnerability offered without pretense, honesty that required tremendous courage to share. "Cole," she said gently, "the man you've become in Dustwood is worthy of love. The question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness, it's whether you can accept it when it's freely offered." He stared at her as though she were speaking a foreign language. "Are you saying you can accept what I've told you?" "I'm saying I love you," she replied, the words emerging with startling clarity. "I love the man who quotes classical poetry and carves chess pieces and discusses education as though it matters more than profit. I love the man who treats children with patience and women with respect, who makes me feel that my thoughts and dreams have value. That man is real, Cole. Whatever tragic mistakes he made in his youth don't diminish who he's become." The kiss that followed was desperate and grateful and tasted of tears neither had realized they were shedding. It acknowledged the pain they had, both carried his guilt and her loneliness, while promising that neither had to bear those burdens in isolation anymore. When they separated, Cole rested his forehead against hers in what had become their private ritual of connection. "I don't deserve such grace. Stop measuring everything by what you think you deserve. Start considering what we can create together." Evelyn smiled with newfound certainty. "Besides, if you're going to be my husband, you'll need to accept that I'm capable of making my own decisions about what's best for my life." "Your husband?" He spoke the words as though testing their possibility. "Even knowing everything?" "Especially knowing everything. But first," she gestured to the scattered correspondence around them, "these need to go. All of them." Cole looked at the letters that had represented his only connection to a painful past. "They're all I have left of that time in my life." "Exactly. That's why they must be destroyed. You cannot build a future while maintaining correspondence with ghosts." Evelyn began collecting the papers with determination. "We'll burn them together, and then we'll begin writing our own story." As they gathered the letters that had held Cole captive to his past, Evelyn realized she had discovered what she hadn't known she was seeking, not merely love, but partnership with someone who understood that people could be transformed by both tragedy and redemption. Cole had revealed his darkest moment and trusted her to see beyond it, to the man he had become. Now it was her turn to demonstrate that forgiveness could indeed serve as the foundation for something beautiful and enduring. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when the late summer heat made the air shimmer like water over the main street of Dustwood. He wore the dusty traveling clothes of a man who had ridden hard for many days, but his bearing suggested authority rather than desperation. His horse was quality stock, well cared for despite the obvious strain of long travel, and the rifle in his saddle scabbard bore the worn familiarity of frequent use. Evelyn noticed him first from the schoolhouse window, where she was preparing lessons for the afternoon session. Something about the deliberate way he surveyed the town made her uneasy, as though he was cataloguing details for future reference. When he dismounted outside Peterson's general store and removed a folded paper from his saddlebags, her uneasiness transformed into genuine alarm. She watched him unfold what was clearly a wanted poster, comparing it to the faces of men passing on the street. When his gaze turned toward the schoolhouse and their eyes met briefly through the window, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. By the time school ended that afternoon, word had spread through Dustwood with the efficiency that only frontier towns could achieve. The stranger was a bounty hunter named Jack Henley, and he was looking for someone. The poster he carried bore the image of a wanted man, though no one could agree on exactly what the man was wanted for or how much the reward might be worth. Evelyn found Cole in the barn behind Patterson's ranch, where he was shoeing horses with the focused intensity that she had learned meant he was thinking through a difficult problem. The rhythmic ring of hammer against anvil provided a counterpoint to their conversation, and she wondered if he had chosen the task specifically for its soothing regularity. "There's a bounty hunter in town," she said without preamble. Cole's hammer paused mid-swing. "How do you know?" Mrs. Henderson saw his poster at the general store. She couldn't make out the details, but she said it looked like an official document from back east. Setting down his tools with careful precision, Cole wiped his hands on the leather apron tied around his waist. What did the man look like? Tall, weathered, armed? The kind of man who makes his living finding people who don't want to be found. Evelyn moved closer, studying Cole's face for signs of the panic she had seen when she discovered his letters. Instead, she found something that might have been resignation. "Cole, if this is about you," "It probably is." He began collecting his tools, each movement economical and purposeful. "I've been expecting something like this for months. I'm surprised it took this long." The calmness in his voice was almost more unsettling than panic would have been. "What are you going to do? Leave? Tonight, if possible, before he identifies me and brings trouble down on everyone in town?" "No." The word came out with more force than Evelyn had intended. "You're not running again." Cole looked at her with something approaching pity. "Evelyn, you don't understand the situation. If that man has a poster with my face on it, then someone back east has decided that the reward for my capture is worth the expense of hiring a professional tracker. That means the charges against me haven't been dropped or forgotten. It means they want me badly enough to hunt me across half a continent. Then we deal with it here, together. There is no we in this situation. I won't let you be destroyed by association with me." The argument that followed was their first real fight, conducted in harsh whispers in the privacy of the barn, while the horses stamped nervously in their stalls. Evelyn accused Cole of cowardice for wanting to run instead of facing his accusers. Cole accused Evelyn of naivety for thinking love could overcome legal charges that included manslaughter. Both accusations contained enough truth to draw blood. "You think I'm afraid of what might happen to me?" Cole said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm afraid of what will happen to you. Do you understand what it means to be associated with a wanted man? Do you have any idea how frontier justice actually works when faced with Eastern warrants and professional bounty hunters? I understand that the man I love is innocent of murder and that running away makes him look guilty. Looking guilty is a luxury I can't afford. Being guilty of something I didn't intend is the reality I have to live with." Their argument was interrupted by the arrival of Jack Henley himself, who appeared in the barn entrance with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to having the upper hand. He was older than Evelyn had estimated, perhaps 50, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors pursuing difficult quarry. His eyes were pale blue and completely without warmth. "Dr. Coleman Thatcher," he said, and it wasn't a question. Cole straightened slowly, and Evelyn saw him transform before her eyes from the gentleman she knew into someone prepared for confrontation. "That depends on who's asking." Henley smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Jack Henley, licensed bounty hunter, operating under authority of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He produced the poster from his coat and held it up for comparison with Cole's face. "Says here you're wanted for the murder of James Morrison in Philadelphia. Reward is $500, dead or alive." The amount was staggering more money than most frontier families saw in several years. Evelyn understood immediately why Henley had been willing to track Cole across the continent. She also understood why Cole had been so certain this day would eventually come. "I'll come quietly," Cole said, "but I want your word that no one else in this town will be bothered about my presence here. That depends on whether anyone else has been harboring a known fugitive." The implication was clear, and Evelyn stepped forward before Cole could respond. "Mr. Henley, I assume you're a man who deals in facts rather than speculation." "I am indeed, ma'am." "Then perhaps you'd be interested in some facts that might not have been available when that poster was issued." She moved to stand beside Cole, close enough to demonstrate her allegiance without quite touching him. "Did your information include the circumstances of James Morrison's death? Did it mention that he struck first, or that Dr. Thatcher was defending himself against a drunken attack?" Henley's pale eyes shifted between them, calculating. "The warrant doesn't specify circumstances, ma'am. It just specifies charges and reward amount." "But you're an intelligent man. You must have wondered why a medical student with no history of violence would suddenly commit murder. You must have investigated beyond the basic charges." For the first time, Henley looked slightly uncomfortable. There were irregularities in some of the witness statements, conflicting accounts about who started the altercation. "But that's not my concern. My concern is bringing in the man named on this poster." Evelyn felt a flutter of hope. If there had been conflicting witness accounts, then Cole's version of events might not be as hopeless as he believed. But before she could pursue that line of reasoning, Cole interrupted. "Mr. Henley, I appreciate Miss Hart's efforts on my behalf, but they're unnecessary. I'll come with you willingly, and we can settle this matter according to the law." "No," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the authority she used when particularly unruly students tested her patience. "Mr. Henley, what exactly would it take to convince you that the man you're seeking might not be guilty of murder?" The bounty hunter was quiet for a long moment, studying both their faces. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "Ma'am, in my experience, most men I track are guilty of something, even if it's not exactly what they're wanted for. But I've also seen situations where circumstances got twisted by people with their own interests. To protect." He folded the poster carefully and returned it to his coat. "I'll give you 24 hours to produce evidence that might change how I handle this situation. If you can show me something that throws real doubt on these charges, I might be willing to wire back east for clarification before making an arrest." It was more than Cole had hoped for and less than Evelyn needed, but it was a chance. As Henley walked away, she turned to Cole with the determination that had brought her west in the first place. "We have 24 hours to prove your innocence. Evelyn, even if we could somehow clear my name, do you understand what this means? My real identity is about to become public knowledge. Everyone in town will know I'm not who I claim to be. The school board will dismiss you for associating with a wanted man. Your reputation, your career, everything you've built here will be destroyed." She looked at him with the fierce expression he had come to love, the one that appeared whenever someone suggested she couldn't handle whatever challenge life presented. "Cole, I didn't come to the frontier because I was afraid of losing my reputation. I came because I wanted to build something meaningful with my life. You are meaningful to me. We are meaningful together. Everything else we can figure out as we go." The wanted poster in Jack Henley's pocket represented the past that Cole had been running from for years. But as Evelyn took his hand and began planning their defense, Cole realized that the future they might build together was worth fighting for, even if that fight meant facing the truth he had been avoiding since the night James Morrison died. The next 18 hours transformed Evelyn into a woman she hadn't known she could become. While Cole paced the confines of Peterson's back room, where he had agreed to remain under Henley's loose supervision, she attacked the problem of proving his innocence with the methodical precision she usually reserved for lesson planning. Her first step was drafting a carefully worded telegram to her former professor at the Boston Teaching College, Dr. Margaret Winters, who maintained extensive connections throughout East Coast academic and legal circles. The message was necessarily brief due to telegraph costs, but Evelyn chose each word with the precision of a legal document. Urgent need information. James Morrison, Philadelphia. Death 1,884. Coleman Thatcher charges. Conflicting witness accounts suggest circumstances misrepresented. Can you investigate through university connections? Time sensitive. The response took 6 hours to arrive, during which Evelyn had organized the entire town of Dustwood into an informal defense committee. Mrs. Patterson testified to Cole's character and work ethic. Doc Brennan vouched for his knowledge of medical procedures, noting that Cole had quietly assisted with several difficult cases around town. Even Mayor Whitman, despite his initial skepticism, admitted that Cole had never caused trouble and had always conducted himself as a gentleman. But it was Dr. Winter's telegram that provided the breakthrough they needed. Morrison case controversial from beginning. Catherine Whitmore's family pressured witnesses to support murder charges. Recently discovered Morrison had gambling debts to dangerous men. Question whether death truly accidental during confrontation or result of prior threats. Investigating further. Maintain hope. The telegram raised more questions than it answered, but it provided something crucial: doubt about the official version of events. If James Morrison had been involved with dangerous creditors, if the Whitmore family had pressured witnesses to support specific testimony, then the case against Cole might be built on a foundation of lies and social manipulation rather than facts. Evelyn spread the telegram on the desk of the schoolhouse, where she had established her headquarters for what she privately thought of as Cole's defense campaign. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the paper, and she found herself thinking about transformation once again, not just her own, but Cole's potential transformation from fugitive back to the respected professional he had been trained to be. "Miss Hart?" Timothy Whitman's voice from the doorway interrupted her thoughts. "My father sent me to ask if you need anything for your research." The boy's offer represented something significant. Despite learning that their mysterious ranch hand was actually a wanted man, the citizens of Dustwood were rallying to support him. It spoke to the character Cole had demonstrated over the months he had lived among them and to the respect Evelyn herself had earned as their teacher. "Thank you, Timothy. Actually, there is something you could help with." She handed him a sheet of paper covered with her careful handwriting. "I need this copied neatly and delivered to Mr. Henley at the hotel. It's a statement of facts that I want him to consider." As Timothy departed with his mission, Evelyn returned to the more complex task she had been working on all day, crafting a comprehensive written testimony that would present Cole's case in the most favorable possible light. The document was part legal brief, part character study, and part philosophical argument about the nature of justice and the importance of context in determining guilt or innocence. She had titled it "A Testament to Character, the Case for Dr. Coleman Thatcher," and it represented everything she had learned about building persuasive arguments during her years of education. Drawing on her knowledge of rhetoric and logic, she constructed a narrative that placed Cole's actions within the broader context of his character and circumstances. The testimony began with documented evidence of Cole's behavior in Dustwood, his assistance with medical emergencies, his respectful treatment of women and children, his work ethic and reliability. She included statements from townspeople who had interacted with him, creating a portrait of someone incapable of unprovoked violence. Then she addressed the night of James Morrison's death, using Cole's own account, but framing it within the legal concept of self-defense. She emphasized the deception that had preceded the confrontation, Morrison's initiation of physical violence, and the accidental nature of the fatal injury. Most importantly, she highlighted the social pressures that might have influenced witness testimony, noting how a wealthy family's desire to protect their daughter's reputation could corrupt the pursuit of justice. The final section was perhaps the most important, an argument that Cole's subsequent behavior proved his innocence. "A guilty man might run from justice," she wrote, "but an innocent man forced to flee would carry his guilt differently. Cole's years of self-imposed exile, his dedication to honest work, his unwillingness to harm others, even when threatened, all of this supported the conclusion that James Morrison's death had been a tragic accident rather than premeditated violence. As she worked, Evelyn became aware of activity outside the schoolhouse. Townspeople were gathering in small groups, their conversations animated but hushed. She realized that Cole's situation had become a focal point for the community's sense of justice and fairness. These were people who understood the difference between legal technicalities and moral truth, and they had decided that Cole Thatcher, regardless of what name he had given them, was one of their own. The sun was setting when Jack Henley appeared in her doorway, his expression unreadable. He held Timothy's delivery in one hand and what appeared to be several telegrams in the other. "Miss Hart, I've read your statement. It's quite thorough." "Thank you. Have you had a chance to consider the information Dr. Winters provided?" Henley moved into the schoolhouse and took a seat across from her desk, his weathered hands folding the papers with careful precision. "I've had a chance to do more than consider it. I've spent the afternoon sending my own telegrams to contacts in Philadelphia." Evelyn's heart began to race. And it appears your Dr. Winters was correct about there being irregularities in the Morrison case. My contact in the Philadelphia Police Department remembers the investigation, says there were questions at the time about witness reliability and family pressure, but the district attorney was eager to close the case quickly. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest Morrison's death might not have been the clear-cut murder it was portrayed as." Henley unfolded one of his telegrams and read from it. Morrison owed gambling debts to some unsavory characters. There were rumors that he had been threatened in the weeks before his death. Several witnesses changed their stories between initial questioning and the formal hearing. Hope surged in Evelyn's chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Does this mean you're willing to reconsider taking Cole back to Philadelphia?" "It means I'm willing to wire back east with a recommendation that the case be reopened and investigated more thoroughly." Henley's pale eyes studied her face. "But Miss Hart, you need to understand what you're asking for. Even if we can prove that Thatcher acted in self-defense, even if we can clear his name completely, his life here is changed forever. Everyone in Dustwood now knows his real identity and background. Some people will always wonder about what really happened that night. Then we'll deal with that when the time comes. The important thing is that the truth comes out." Henley was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've been tracking wanted men for 15 years, and I've learned to read guilt in a person's face and manner. Dr. Coleman Thatcher doesn't carry himself like a murderer. He carries himself like a man who's been punished for something he didn't do." The admission was more than Evelyn had dared to hope for. "So you'll help us?" "I'll wire Philadelphia tonight with a recommendation that they reopen the investigation based on new information about Morrison's debts and the reliability of witness testimony. I'll also recommend that they consider the possibility that Thatcher acted in self-defense against an unprovoked attack. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Dr. Thatcher remains here in Dustwood under my supervision until we get a response from back east. Could take days, could take weeks, but Miss Hart." He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. "You should know that what you've done here today, the way you've fought for this man, it's changed my mind about more than just his case. It's reminded me that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, and that it takes people like you to make sure the distinction matters." After Henley left, Evelyn sat alone in the schoolhouse as darkness settled over Dustwood. Her written testimony lay before her on the desk, pages covered with careful arguments and passionate advocacy for the man she loved. She had never imagined herself capable of such fierce determination, had never thought she would find herself fighting legal battles or challenging the decisions of distant authorities. But then, she had never imagined herself in love with a man whose past contained such complexity, or finding herself part of a community willing to stand up for what they believed was right, regardless of official pronouncements from back east. The transformation that had begun with Cole's recitation of Virgil in this very room was nearing completion. She was no longer simply Miss Hart, the schoolteacher who valued her independence above all else. She had become someone willing to risk everything she had built for the chance to build something even better with the person she loved. Tomorrow would bring whatever response Philadelphia sent to Henley's wire. But tonight, she would go to Cole with the news that they had won their first victory in the fight to reclaim his name and their future together. The written testimony on her desk represented more than legal arguments. It represented her complete commitment to the life they were building together, word by carefully chosen word. The telegram arrived 3 days later, during the morning hours when Dustwood was beginning its daily routine of commerce and conversation. Evelyn was teaching her youngest students their letters when Timothy Whitman burst through the schoolhouse door with the yellow paper clutched in his hand and excitement written across his face. "Miss Hart, Mr. Henley says to bring this to you right away." She accepted the telegram with hands that trembled slightly, aware that everything she and Cole had hoped for might be contained within its brief message. The children sensed the importance of the moment and fell silent, their slate boards forgotten as they watched their teacher unfold what might be the most significant piece of paper any of them would ever witness. The message was from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, addressed to Jack Henley, but clearly intended for broader consumption. Morrison case reopened based on new evidence. Stop confession letter from Thomas Bradshaw, gambling associate, discovered among deceased effects. Stop, Bradshaw admits, threatening Morrison night of death. Stop, witness testimony, recanted by 2 individuals. Stop charges against Coleman. Thatcher dropped. Stop warrant. Recalled. Stop formal exoneration to follow. Stop. Evelyn read the telegram 3 times before its full meaning penetrated the shock that seemed to have frozen her ability to think clearly. Cole was free. Not just free to remain in Dustwood under Henley's supervision, but completely exonerated of all charges related to James Morrison's death. "Children," she said, her voice not quite steady, "please continue practicing your letters. I'll be back shortly." She found Cole in the barn, where he had spent most of the past 3 days, ostensibly helping with ranch work, but actually waiting for news that would determine the rest of his life. He was mending a bridle with the careful attention to detail that she had come to recognize as his way of managing anxiety, his fingers working leather and metal with practiced precision. "Cole," she said, and something in her voice made him look up immediately. She handed him the telegram without speaking, watching his face as he read the words that restored his name and his future. The transformation was immediate, and profound tension that she hadn't fully realized he was carrying melted from his shoulders, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked truly at peace. "Thomas Bradshaw," he said finally. "I remember him. He was one of Morrison's gambling partners, always hanging around the edges of social events, always looking for opportunities to make money from other people's weaknesses. He confessed to threatening James Morrison? More than that, apparently. If he left a confession letter, he probably admitted to killing Morrison himself." Cole set down the bridle and stood, moving to the barn window, where afternoon light streamed across the hay-covered floor. Morrison must have refused to pay his debts, or maybe he threatened to expose Bradshaw to the police. Either way, Bradshaw decided to solve his problem permanently. "But Morrison died during your confrontation with him. How could Bradshaw have killed him?" Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking through possibilities that had never occurred to him during his years of self-imposed exile. "What if Morrison was already injured when I found him with Catherine? What if Bradshaw had already attacked him, and Morrison was trying to escape when we confronted each other?" The possibility reframed everything they thought they knew about that night. If Morrison had already been threatened or even attacked by Bradshaw, then his behavior during the confrontation with Cole, his drunkenness, his quick resort to violence, his fatal fall might have been the actions of a man already desperate and injured rather than simply a lover defending his relationship. "It doesn't matter now," Evelyn said, though she could see that it mattered tremendously to Cole. "What matters is that your name has been cleared and you're free to reclaim your life." Our life, Cole corrected, turning from the window to face her. If you'll still have me, because everything has changed now, Evelyn. I'm no longer just Cole Thatcher, the mysterious ranch hand. I'm Dr. Coleman Thatcher, formerly wanted for murder, recently exonerated, and completely without a practice or profession to support a wife. She studied his face, seeing uncertainty there despite the joy of his exoneration. Are you asking me to marry you, Dr. Thatcher? I'm asking if you want to marry someone whose future is completely unknown. I have medical training but no license to practice in Montana territory. I have education, but no connections to help me establish myself professionally. I have a cleared name, but a past that people will always whisper about. Evelyn moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes, close enough to rest her hands on his chest and feel the steady rhythm of his heart. I'm asking if you want to marry someone who fell in love with a cowboy who quoted Virgil and carved chess pieces. Someone who doesn't care whether you practice medicine or raise cattle or teach school, as long as we build whatever life we choose together. The kiss that followed was different from their previous kisses, deeper, more certain, carrying the weight of a future that was finally possible. When they broke apart, Cole rested his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become their private ritual of connection and understanding. Yes, he said simply, to all of it, to marriage, to building a life together, to whatever comes next. Good, she said, smiling with a happiness that felt almost too large for her chest to contain. Because I already told Mrs. Patterson that we'd need the church next Sunday for a wedding ceremony. Cole laughed, the first completely unguarded laugh she had ever heard from him. You were that confident in Thomas Bradshaw's confession? I was that confident in us, she replied. The confession just made it official. Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect late summer weather that seemed designed specifically for new beginnings. The church, the same one-room building that served as schoolhouse and meeting hall, had been transformed by the women of Dustwood into something approaching elegance. Wild prairie flowers filled mason jars along the windowsills, their colors bright against the weathered wood walls, and someone had found enough white fabric to create simple but beautiful decorations for the altar area. Evelyn stood in the small room behind the church that usually served as storage for hymnals and cleaning supplies, trying to calm the nervous excitement that made her hands tremble as she adjusted the simple wedding dress she had sewn during the 3 days between Cole's exoneration and their wedding. The dress was practical rather than elaborate cream-colored wool that would serve her well in the months and years to come, but Mrs. Patterson had contributed a piece of her grandmother's lace for the collar, and Mrs. Henderson had insisted on lending her own mother's pearl earrings. You look beautiful, dear, Mrs. Crenshaw said, her previous disapproval of Evelyn's unmarried state apparently forgotten in the romance of the situation. Dr. Thatcher is a very fortunate man. The title still sounded strange when applied to Cole, but Evelyn was gradually adjusting to the idea that the man she was about to marry was not just the thoughtful cowboy who had won her heart, but a trained physician with the education and credentials to practice medicine anywhere he chose. The possibilities that opened up were both exciting and overwhelming. Through the thin wall, she could hear the murmur of conversation as the townspeople gathered for the ceremony. It seemed that nearly everyone in Dustwood had chosen to attend, along with ranch hands and families from the surrounding area who had heard about the dramatic events of the past week. Jack Henley was still in town, having decided to stay for the wedding before continuing his journey back to Pennsylvania with news of the case's resolution. A soft knock on the door announced the arrival of young Sarah Patterson, who had been appointed to serve as Evelyn's attendant for the ceremony. Miss Hart, Father Murphy is ready to begin whenever you are. Father Murphy had arrived that morning on the monthly circuit that brought him to the smaller settlements throughout the territory. He was a practical man who understood that frontier weddings often involved unusual circumstances, and he had accepted the story of Cole's identity revelation and legal exoneration with the equanimity of someone who had seen much stranger situations in his pastoral career. Evelyn took a final look at her reflection in the small mirror that had been hung on the wall for the occasion. The woman looking back at her was someone she still didn't entirely recognize, calmer than the anxious schoolteacher who had arrived in Dustwood 3 years ago, more confident than the woman who had made her desperate Latin challenge only months before. This was someone who had fought for love and won, someone who had discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. The simple gold band that Cole had crafted for their wedding caught the light on her finger. He had made it himself in Peterson's back room, working with tools borrowed from the blacksmith and gold from a coin he had saved from his previous life. The ring was perfectly smooth, its surface reflecting years of careful craftsmanship compressed into a few days of intense labor. Inside the band, he had engraved a single Latin word, semper, always. As she prepared to leave the small room and walk down the makeshift aisle to where Cole waited, Evelyn thought about the artifact that had brought them together. Not the chess set or the pressed flowers or any of the physical objects that had marked their courtship, but the Latin words themselves, the ancient language that had served as a bridge between two people who might otherwise never have found each other. Arma virumque cano, she whispered to herself, remembering the opening of the Aeneid that Cole had recited on that transformative afternoon. Arms and the man. The epic of a hero driven by fate to found something new and lasting. Perhaps it was fitting that their own story had begun with those words, since they too were founders of sorts, creators of a partnership that would serve as the foundation for whatever they built together in the years to come. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Cole stood waiting for her at the front of the church, wearing his best shirt and a borrowed jacket that made him look every inch the educated professional he had been trained to be. But when their eyes met as she walked down the aisle, she saw not Dr. Coleman Thatcher or the mysterious Cole Thatcher, but simply the man who had changed her life by proving that intelligence and gentleness could coexist, that respect and passion were not mutually exclusive, that love could indeed conquer the obstacles that seemed insurmountable when faced alone. Their vows were traditional words spoken with personal meaning. When Cole promised to love and honor her for better or worse, in sickness and health, she heard his commitment to accepting all aspects of her independence and ambition. When she promised to forsake all others and cleave only to him, she was acknowledging that partnership with the right person enhanced, rather than diminished, her sense of self. The moment when Father Murphy pronounced them husband and wife felt both like the end of one story and the beginning of another. The kiss they shared was witnessed by the entire community that had supported them through the dramatic events of the past week, and the applause that followed carried genuine warmth and celebration. At the reception that followed in Peterson's general store, the largest indoor space available, the mood was festive and optimistic. The same people who had rallied to Cole's defense during his legal troubles now celebrated his marriage with the enthusiasm of a community that had invested emotionally in the outcome of his story. Mayor Whitman raised a toast to the bride and groom, noting that Dustwood had gained not just a married schoolteacher, but a qualified physician. Doc Brennan, whose medical practice had been limited by his veterinary training, spoke enthusiastically about the possibility of collaborating with someone who had formal medical education. But it was Jack Henley's toast that touched Evelyn most deeply. The bounty hunter, who would be departing Dustwood the following morning, raised his glass with the solemnity of someone offering an official proclamation. "To Dr. and Mrs. Thatcher," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded store, "may your marriage prove that the past doesn't have to define the future, and that sometimes the best justice comes from people who refuse to accept that things are too complicated to be made right." As the evening wound down and the townspeople began to drift back to their homes, Evelyn and Cole found themselves alone in the schoolhouse where their courtship had begun. The building looked different in the lamplight, somehow larger and smaller simultaneously, as though their marriage had changed not just their relationship to each other, but their relationship to the space where they had discovered their connection. "So, Mrs. Thatcher," Cole said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure, "what do you think comes next?" Evelyn looked around the room that had been her world for 3 years, then at the man who had expanded that world beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. "I think," she said, "we figure it out together, one day at a time." The ring on her finger caught the lamplight as she reached for his hand, and she thought about the Latin word engraved inside its golden circle, semper, always. It was a promise that would define whatever came next in their shared story. 1 year later, the new sign hanging above the entrance to Dustwood's expanded educational facility caught the morning light with the pride of achievement made manifest. Dustwood Academy, it read in carefully painted letters, founded by Dr. and Mrs. Thatcher, 1885. Below the main inscription, in smaller but equally precise lettering, appeared the Latin phrase that had brought the founders together, per aspera ad astra, through adversity to the stars. Evelyn, now Mrs. Thatcher, though she continued to use her maiden name professionally, stood in the doorway of what had once been a simple one-room schoolhouse and was now the academic wing of a growing institution. The original building remained largely unchanged, but it had been joined by a second structure that housed Cole's medical practice and a small but well-equipped library that served both educational and community needs. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened with the kind of steady progress that characterized all of their joint endeavors. Cole had spent the winter months preparing for the territorial medical examination, studying by lamplight, while Evelyn graded papers and planned lessons. When spring arrived, he had traveled to Helena for testing and returned with full authorization to practice medicine throughout Montana Territory. His first patients had been the children of Dustwood, many of whom had never received proper medical care beyond Doc Brennan's well-intentioned but limited veterinary expertise. Cole's gentle manner and thorough training had quickly established him as someone parents trusted with their most precious concerns, and word of his skill had spread throughout the region with the efficiency of frontier communication. But it was the educational expansion that represented their most ambitious shared achievement. Using Cole's connections from his university days and Evelyn's practical experience with frontier teaching, they had petitioned the territorial government for recognition as an official academy. The designation allowed them to offer advanced coursework that prepared students for university admission, something that had been impossible in the region's previous one-room schools. The morning ritual of ringing the school bell, the same bell that had called students to lessons when Evelyn first arrived in Dustwood, now served to gather not just local children, but boarding students from ranches and settlements throughout the territory. Young people who might otherwise have received only the most basic education now had access to classical languages, advanced mathematics, literature, and natural sciences. Timothy Whitman, now 16 and preparing for university admission, served as assistant instructor for the younger children while pursuing his own studies in classical literature under Cole's guidance. Sarah Patterson had developed into a remarkable artist whose illustrations now decorated textbooks used throughout the territory. Even the Riley twins had found their calling, channeling their mechanical aptitude into the maintenance and improvement of the Academy's physical plant. Mrs. Thatcher. The voice belonged to Mary Chen, now fluent in English and serving as the Academy's librarian while pursuing her own advanced studies. The territorial inspector is here for his annual visit. Evelyn smoothed her practical brown dress, not so different from the one she had worn during her first confrontation with the town council, though her circumstances had changed dramatically, and walked toward the main building where the inspector waited. The annual visits had become routine, but they still represented the official recognition of what she and Cole had built together. The inspector, a serious man named Robert Hayes, who took his educational responsibilities seriously, spent the morning observing classes and reviewing student progress records. His notes were extensive, and his questions demonstrated genuine interest in the Academy's innovative approaches to frontier education. "Dr. Thatcher," he said as they concluded the formal inspection, "your integration of practical medical instruction with classical curriculum is remarkable. I've seen nothing like it in the territory." Cole, who had been demonstrating basic anatomical concepts using a skeleton borrowed from his medical practice, smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his true calling. "We've discovered that students learn more effectively when they can see connections between different areas of knowledge. Medicine benefits from classical training in logic and observation, while Latin and Greek become more meaningful when students understand their relevance to modern scientific terminology. And Mrs. Thatcher, your students' performance on territorial examinations continues to exceed averages throughout the region. What do you attribute this to?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "I think it comes from treating each student as an individual with unique potential rather than trying to force everyone into identical educational molds. When young people feel that their particular strengths are recognized and developed, they're more willing to work on areas where they need improvement." The inspector made additional notes, then closed his portfolio with the air of someone completing a satisfactory task. "I'll be recommending continued territorial recognition and support for the Dustwood Academy. Your work here represents exactly the kind of educational innovation we need as the territory develops towards statehood." After the inspector's departure, Evelyn and Cole found themselves alone in the library as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shelves they had built together. The space represented everything they had hoped to achieve. Hundreds of books carefully selected to provide both classical education and practical knowledge. Comfortable seating areas where students could pursue independent research, and display cases containing specimens and artifacts that brought abstract learning into tangible reality. "Do you ever miss it?" Evelyn asked, settling into one of the chairs they had purchased for faculty use. "The life you might have had back east?" Cole looked up from the medical journal he had been reading, his expression thoughtful. "I miss the certainty I thought I had then, the sense that life followed predictable patterns and that success meant achieving predetermined goals. But you don't miss the actual life. How could I miss something that was never really mine? That life belonged to someone who had never been tested, who had never discovered what he was truly capable of when circumstances demanded everything he had to give." Cole set aside his journal and moved to sit beside her. "This life, our life, is something we've built together from nothing but determination and love. It's ours in a way that inherited privilege could never be." Evelyn reached for his hand, noting how the calluses from his ranching days had been joined by the ink stains that marked his medical practice and teaching responsibilities. These were hands that had learned to create and heal and build, hands that told the story of transformation through adversity. "The children asked me today when we might be expanding the academy to include younger students," she said. "Sarah Patterson suggested that we could establish a preparatory program for children who aren't yet ready for the classical curriculum." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that any expansion would depend on whether we have the resources and energy to do it properly." She paused, then smiled with the kind of private happiness that had become familiar over their year of marriage. "I also told them that we might have additional considerations to account for in our planning." Cole looked at her more closely, and she saw the moment when her meaning became clear to him. "Evelyn, are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that by next spring, the Dustwood Academy may need to accommodate the educational needs of one additional student. A very small one, initially, but one with presumably excellent potential given his or her parentage." The kiss that followed was soft and full of wonder, carrying all the joy of their wedding day, but tempered with the deeper satisfaction of love that had been tested and proven durable. When they broke apart, Cole rested his forehead against hers in their familiar gesture of connection and understanding. "A baby," he said, as though testing the weight of the words. "A baby who will grow up knowing that education and love and determination can overcome any obstacle. A baby who will never have to choose between being intellectually curious and being loved for exactly who he or she is." Outside the library windows, the sun was setting over the Montana Territory with the kind of spectacular display that never failed to humble human ambitions with reminders of natural grandeur. But inside the academy they had built together, surrounded by books and dreams, and the tangible proof that two people could indeed transform their circumstances through mutual dedication. Evelyn and Cole contemplated the future with the confidence of those who had already proven that the impossible was simply another word for the difficult. The Latin inscription above their door promised that through adversity one could reach the stars. They had discovered that with the right partner, the journey itself could be as rewarding as any destination they might ultimately achieve. Their child would learn that lesson not from books alone, but from the living example of parents who had chosen to build something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of love, respect, and shared commitment to making the world a little better than they had found it. As darkness settled over Dustwood, the academy stood as testimony to transformation, not just of two lives, but of an entire community that had learned to see education as the foundation of hope and possibility. The building that had once housed a single schoolteacher's desperate challenge had become the cornerstone of dreams realized through partnership and perseverance.